Wilfred Creighton and the Expropriation of Land for the National Park in 1936. Edited from Mr. Creighton's Conversations with Kenneth Donovan. Wilfred Creighton was a provincial forester and deputy minister for the Nova Scotia Department of Lands and Forests. Early in his career, in 1936, he was given the job of negotiating payment for homes on land that had just been expropriated for the up-and-coming Cape Breton Highlands National Park. Wilfred Creighton said, "I was young and it was a new job to me and I had to go by trial and error. When I was up in Cape Breton in 1936, I had no notion that there would be a national park there. But shortly after, engineers from the National Parks branch arrived in Halifax. They went up to Cape Breton and were looking over the property. At that time, A.S. Macmillan, who was Minister of Highways, was the only provincial minister who had legal authority to expropriate land. So Macmillan made the expropriation and he sent a fellow down to Cape Breton to negotiate settlements. And from the stories I got when I finally arrived, a landowner would file a claim for $3,000. They told me this fellow's approach was, "We'll make it $5,000. That'll be $4,000 for you and $1,000 for me." Well, I can't vouch for that, but this is what people told me. And he was there for some time. They said that he spent most of his time drinking rum. And he finally had drinking tremors and they had him in the hospital at Cheticamp. The nurses said he dirted their beds and threw up. He was an awful character. He eventually disappeared from Cheticamp and when I got there he hadn't paid his bills. Then Macmillan sent down another fellow. He didn't drink rum, he preferred gin. I don't know what his negotiations amounted to, but he didn't make any settlements. Ken Donovan said, "Did the first fellow make any?" No. Neither one made any settlements. So they must have gone down around 1937. I was a provincial forester and the job was dumped in Macquarie's lap as Minister of Lands and Forests. I was a young forester and if there was any dirty job to do, it would come my way. So I was sent down to negotiate. Went to Cheticamp first, and the attitude was, "Well, there's been 2 people here, didn't make any settlements, you're the 3rd, who's going to be the 4th? They didn't want to talk to me, the people were hostile, they were being put out of their homes. Not in Cheticamp village itself, but in Cap Rouge, there were a great many landowners. There were 70 homes in the park and about 300 private landowners. Most of the homes were at Cap Rouge. There were 3 at Pleasant Bay and there were 3 around the Big Intervale. I can't remember if there were any homes at South Ingonish. Yes, there were. Because at Freshwater Lake there were a couple of homes. There was a lot of land at Freshwater. And then up the Clybourne where the golf course is, all that land was expropriated. And then the Oxford Paper Company, the big lease for pulpwood rights in the Highlands that had to be settled." Ken Donovan said, "Did most of those people speak English in the Cap Rouge area?" "Quite a few did. I knew a little French. I worked in Quebec, and knew all the bad French. When they called me names in French I could understand it. But I hired a man that was bilingual to come with me. T.C. LeBlanc, and he was a veteran of the 25th Battalion in the First War. He was from the north end of Cheticamp, and he came around with me." Ken Donovan said, "Could you explain the procedure to me?" The properties had already been expropriated. The properties were now the possession of His Majesty the King and the right of this province of Nova Scotia. But people were still living on them. And they were offered a certain amount. Most of them had filed, some of them at least had written in stating what they would settle for. So I approached them. Some of them spoke English. I didn't know anything, I went in green. I had no experience with that. And I was dealing with the Acadians in Cheticamp, the Highland Scottish people at Pleasant Bay and Cape North, the Big Intervale, and near Dingwall. Then I got to North Ingonish where there were largely Anglicans, a few Presbyterians. The Highland Scottish people, or Highlanders. There were Newfoundlanders there that were Anglican. There were no homes expropriated in North Ingonish, but the properties extended back, and it was little bits of the back end of properties. And there were only a few, there weren't very many homes at South Ingonish. The Syrian peddler that was there, the park took only part of his property. He was the most savage man that I ran into at South Ingonish. But he was really cross because the park didn't take all his land. He was getting a good price for it. I had a young lawyer, Smith McIver, working with me for a while, helping me search titles, and this peddler met McIver on the road and mistook McIver for me. Oh, he was swearing, and he scolded. And then he stopped for breath and then he turned to McIlver and he said, "Now, when's that Antichrist McIlver coming down here? I'd like to meet him." McIlver says, "I think he'll be down next week." Ken Donovan said, "Were most of the people you dealt with illiterate?" "No, a few were. Assessing a home at Cap Rouge, the majority were literate. The one case that I found most interesting was James Donovan, or Jimmy Donovan as the people called him, who had been illiterate until the age of 70. He had learned to read and write and he became quite a prolific writer. I found him to be a fine old gentleman. He was the one who wouldn't settle for what I offered him. The court gave him $200 less than I had offered. I was sorry for him. I tried my best to get at least what I offered him. I think I had offered him $1,200 and the court allowed him $1,000 or something like that. A dollar was worth something then. I have a little guilty feeling that I cheated the people." Ken Donovan said, "But you didn't feel that way at the time. You felt you just had a job to do." "Yes. And most of them I made friends with. Oh, I paid prices far in excess of what they could have received if they had sold it to a local person. There was one property at Big Intervale where I felt I cheated a man badly, but he accepted my offer. I've regretted many times that I didn't say to him, 'Wait till I settle with everybody else, and then I'll come and talk to you.' I should have. That's the only man that I feel I had cheated unjustly. And we parted. Oh, he called on me in this house and was as friendly as could be. He told me at the time he could have gone to Pictou County or Ontario and bought a better property with the money I gave him. But he had a lovely home and he was in the Aspee Valley, I think they call it the Big Intervale, and he had a fine wood lot, and a lovely home. And he had spring water piped into his kitchen. It was a tough position for you to be put in. And I was just turned loose with no advice and no help and I had to learn by trial and error. I think I did a pretty good job. Particularly when there were these two men ahead of me that muddied the waters. I can remember going to one house. You were in the kitchen and from the kitchen there was just a straight stairway, going up to the loft. There were these children. 2 and 2 on the step. The husband was away, and we talked to his wife. I had T.C. LeBlanc with me as an interpreter. I could understand a lot of the French, but I wasn't fluent so I had T.C. interpreting, and the woman wouldn't talk. She said her husband was away and she'd be a fool to discuss anything with us. But the children were sitting on the step, 2 by 2, and they were so close together and they never uttered a word. But if you moved, all the heads would turn. There was a baby being fed on a nursing bottle and there may have been a little milk in it, but there certainly was tea. Oh, the poverty. They'd get lots of fish and no doubt they got some deer meat and so on. But it was pitiful. Now would these people be among the poorest people that you came across? Yes. There was one other old man that just had nothing, and he didn't have any property. His son was living in a house of driftwood. Oh, it was something scandalous. I can remember the old man, T.C. LeBlanc was talking to him and the old man couldn't speak English but he gave T.C. quite a harangue and then said, in French, "No money, never, I am finished." He had no property that he owned outright and had a hard job. I got a few $100s to pay him. I was dealing with a lawyer in Halifax and he had no land, he had nothing. Ken Donovan said, "Do you think these people were better off as a result of being expropriated?" No. They were in a foreign environment. They had a way of life there, it was cruel moving people. If they had given them life tenancy, some would have left immediately and as they left others gradually would have gone. They wouldn't be much worse off. I noticed from the photographs that some don't have curtains on the house. No. It was poverty-stricken. Would they have had a little garden as well? I don't think they did. There are characteristics about the Acadians that I admire. Generation after generation, a man died and left a dozen children and they divided his property up by word of mouth. A great many of the men that were in the park were fishermen. They had a little wharf down in the water, they had a house lot, a little piece of meadowland, and they had a little piece of woodland. Very few of them had a description that a surveyor could follow, but they would say, "Everybody knows where that land is." And everybody did know. And there never was a case with the Acadians trying to claim land that anybody else owned. Land ownership with them was sacred, and if a man told you that was his land, and all his neighbors agreed, then it was. It just worried me to see people put off their land. That bothered me to no end.